Okie dokie. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for spending your evening with me. I'm going to be talking about the life cycle of clothing. My name is Erica Holst, and I am the curator of history at the Illinois State Museum. And so, let me see here, make sure all my buttons are working. This talk is inspired by an exhibition that we had in 2020 and 21 at the State Museum called Fashioning Illinois. And that was about first of all, the exhibition was created because we have this wonderful collection of 19th century women's clothing that had never been on view. And so we wanted just to first get it out so people could see it and enjoy it. But as we were doing background research into these garments, we started to realize just how much time and effort people, and especially women, invested in their clothing in the 19th century and into the 20th century. And so this talk is a way to kind of dig into what it was like, not just to, wear these pretty clothes, but all the work that went into them. And then we're going to wrap up by kind of contrasting that with where we are today, because we've come a long way. We've gone from being producers of clothing to consumers to clothing, and then just in most people's lifetimes, we've also seen the rise of fast fashion too. So we'll wind up thinking about that and how it's affected our lives. Before I dive in, I do want to give a plug to my home institution. The Illinois State Museum is your museum. It belongs to the people of Illinois. Our museum interprets science, natural history, anthropology, history, and art. We are open 7 days a week with free admission. We're actually closed because of a plumbing project right now, but we're going to open back up November 4th. So if anyone ever finds themselves in Springfield and has some time to kill, we hope you'll come in and visit us. We're right by the state capitol. You can actually see the very tip of the dome over the top of the museum building there. And I also want to tell you a little bit about what I do as a history curator, because it's most of the time a pretty fun gig. Basically, my main role is to manage and develop and interpret and share the collection of historical objects that we have. And so that can look like doing an exhibition, that can look like giving a talk like this, helping to grow the collection with cool donations. And I really love material culture, like objects, the objects that people from history left behind. And so I'm often asked what's my favorite thing in the collection. And it's hard to pick just one. It's like picking one of your children. But if I had to put a point on it, we got this donation of clothing about 5 years ago from this woman. It originally belonged to this woman named Caroline Sutherland, and it included her wedding dress, a lot of her undergarments. And she had such a poignant story because she got married in 1846. She and her husband moved to Illinois. She got pregnant right away. She became a mother. Sadly, her baby was born and then died 2 weeks after it was born. And then 1 year to the day, Caroline herself died. And so these garments actually like represent the last year of her life and show that emotional roller coaster and just all the big life events that happen in quick succession. And they help to give us a face and remember someone who kind of would have been forgotten by history. There were so many women who died young in childbirth in the 19th century, and mostly they're kind of forgotten. So it's nice to be able to rescue at least one person's story and flesh it out a little bit. And then I have to give one more shameless plug. We are always looking to build the museum's collection. So if anyone has an object that you feel like has a really cool story and connection to Illinois and you feel like it belongs in a museum, I'd love to hear about it. My contact information is down below, and I'll show it again at the end of the talk. But now, diving into our talk about clothing, the first thing I want to ask you is, where did the clothes that you have on come from? And just give that some thought. We can have a kind of discussion in the Q&A too. I welcome comments at the end of the program. But I wanted to start out by letting you know that in the 18th century for men and most of the 19th century for women, all clothing was made for somebody, not anybody. That means that most of women's garments, outer garments at least, were fitted specifically to their body. And this was a challenge for us when we were mounting this exhibit of historic 19th century clothing because we did not have the budget for the really fancy custom-made Ethafoam dress forms, like made to specific measurements. We had the budget for the $100 styrofoam mannequins from Etsy. And so all these garments were fitted to the precise measurements of the women who had once worn them. So most of the time I had to take an electric knife and like shave down these mannequins so they would be small enough to for the clothing to fit. But then I also had to kind of take poly batting and build out like a hips and a bust and everything to make them fit. So today we're used to, you know your size. If you're a medium, you go to Target, you can get a shirt, pull it off the rack and be pretty sure it's going to fit. Back then, a woman had to, make clothes that fit her specifically. And that also meant that, if she gained weight, if she became pregnant, if she lost weight, she had to haul out her sewing kit because her clothes would no longer fit her precisely. So clothing was constantly like dynamic and changing in response to women's bodies. So all 19th century women knew how to sew. And there's this wonderful quote by a woman who wrote a domestic advice manual. And she said, "A woman who does not know how to sew is as deficient in her education as a man who does not know how to write." So this was a life skill that was taught to pretty much all girls, whether you were rich or poor, no matter your race or nationality or ethnicity. Most little girls had a needle put in their hand very young. And most girls learned at home what was called plain sewing. And this is things like hemming and patching and darning and making buttonholes and things that are useful in the context of a household that has a lot of textiles in it. So the thing that you're looking at on the right-hand side of the screen is a darning sampler. And it's really hard to tell because it's just, white and white on white. But this was a girl's like kind of like her final exam in basic sewing skills. So on this piece of cloth, there is like a hook and eye. There's a place of where the garment has been patched. There's a place where it has been darned. There's hems and buttonholes, and all those skills are demonstrated on that one little textile there. Some girls who were more well off were sent to a girls' school. Before the 1850s, there was no public education in Illinois, so parents would have to pay for their kids to be educated. And in most households, if if they were of limited means and there wasn't enough money to educate all the kids, the boys would be sent to school and the girls would have to forego an education. But there were some lucky and affluent girls who did get sent to school, and they would often create what's called a sampler, which is what you see on the left there. And this is, again, kind of like a final exam and diploma all rolled into one. It shows off the fancy embroidery stitches that, the family paid extra for this girl to learn, and she can now use to kind of embellish things in her household. Usually there's like numbers and letters to show her mastery of a little bit of math and the alphabet. Often there's a little poem or Bible verse. And families would take these samplers and hang them proudly in their home because it indicated that they could have afforded to send their daughter to school, they spared her from the housework, and also that she had mastered these skills. So sewing was so connected with women that it was called women's work, and the word work was used synonymously with sewing in the 19th century. So on the left is the contents of a work basket, which is a sewing basket, assembling of all the tools, and women usually had at least one. Sometimes women would have multiple in different rooms. They didn't really have the like chilling on the couch and zoning out to Netflix mentality that we did today. If it's the end of the day and most of your housework is done and it's time to relax, that usually means like sitting in a chair, but you could also be knitting or doing a little bit of sewing with your hands. They didn't do a whole lot of just straight up nothing the way I like to do today. The thing on the right is a work stand, and this is a piece of furniture that is kind of gendered. It's one of the few pieces of early furniture that is made specifically for women, and it is, this little stand that's meant to hold a woman's sewing supplies. So women kept the household clothed. Their responsibility included creating and maintaining things like sheets and towels and pillowcases and diapers. And as far as clothing went, they also typically created their own undergarments. So the thing on the left that you see there is called a chemise. It's like the basic underpinning for a woman. This is the thing that you are going to wear closest to your body. And this chemise is going to absorb kind of the sweat and oils and stuff that you're producing. It's also going to act as a barrier between your skin and your outer garments. This is, like I said, the first thing on. So if you've ever seen someone like dressing up in old-timey clothing and they're wearing a corset right on their bare skin, like, nope, that's not the way it worked. The corset would have gone on top of the chemise. Women also tended to make their children's clothing. Boys and girls were dressed in long white cotton and linen garments until basically until they were toddlers, until they were mobile. And those were garments that were often made by, the mom. And then women typically made their husband's shirts as well. They might make their entire suit of clothing depending on, their level of wealth and if they were living in the country versus the city. Men, especially men who lived in urban environments, would often see a tailor for a more precise fitted suit, but usually the women were at least making the shirts at home. And so what you see with most of these garments is they're not like super technically challenging, right? It's a lot of rectangles joined together. So women who have these basic sewing skills because they've been sewing since they were 5 years old, this is like well within the realm of their ability to create. So in terms of outer garments, women had two choices, although it wasn't usually that cut and dry. They usually kind of did a hybrid of one or of both. They could make their own dresses. Oops, and it said garments dresses. Sorry, ignore that. And the dress on the left was made by a woman named Susanna Watson from Southern Illinois in the 1850s. And she literally constructed that dress from start to finish. She raised the sheep, she sheared the wool, she carded it, she spun it, she wove it, she dyed it, and she made the dress. And if you were to look at it close up, you would see it's not like the most technically precise garment. In fact, in that picture, you can probably tell that her collar doesn't quite match up. A little piece of it is sticking up. So she's not going to like be walking any runways anywhere in that dress, but she created a, sturdy, serviceable garment for herself to wear. Other women might hire a dressmaker to make a dress for them, and that is the case with the dress on the right. This is a wedding dress worn by a woman named Elizabeth Graham when she got married in 1876. And Elizabeth Graham was a farmer's daughter. They weren't especially wealthy, but they did spend the money to have a dressmaker make this dress for a special occasion. And in the 19th century, it was very common for wedding dresses to be considered a best dress. So she would be married in it, but it's not like today where then it goes, in a box under your bed and you just save it for all time. She would have worn it like the next Sunday to church, and it kind of would have been her nicer dress for as long as it was in style. And you can see that this garment has like ruffles and ruches and bustle and bow and different fabrics and a precise fit. And it's very technically difficult to create. So it really would have taken someone with an exceptional level of dressmaking skills to make that for her. And then between making your own dress or hiring someone else, a lot of women did kind of in the middle. Like they might make a house dress for themselves, but they would hire out for a fancy dress, or they would hire a dressmaker, but they would cut out the fabric for them or baste it together for the dressmaker, and the dressmaker would actually get the precise fit and do the finishing work. There were professional dressmakers out there. It was considered a skilled profession, and this paid the most highly of any of the 19th century avenues of women's work. Remember, there's not a whole lot of options for women's work, especially before the Civil War. Women basically could be school teachers or nurses, and these are professions that didn't command a whole lot of pay in that time. They could be factory workers or domestic workers, which also didn't command a whole lot of pay and were also very like laborious. But a woman who was super talented with her needlework could kind of start a business as a dressmaker. And this means that she's an independent contractor. She's choosing her own clients. She is commanding respect within the community, and she's getting paid really well. So this is an avenue for women who maybe have been widowed or need to support their family, or maybe even just don't want to be married and want to support themselves. That was kind of like the best you could do, was to become a dressmaker. Oh, and I want to go back and mention that dressmaking is a separate skill from being a seamstress. And a seamstress was considered unskilled work. And the reason being, because sewing was such a universal skill among women, it was assumed that all women knew how to sew and it wasn't anything worth paying especially well for. So seamstresses would typically work for a larger tailor, and the tailor would give them a pre-cut bundle of fabric for, shirts or pants or something. The woman would take them home, sew them in her own home, and then bring them back. And they really just not paid very well at all for that, in addition to having to like eat the overhead of like the lights and the heating her own house, as well as taking the time to go pick up the fabric and drop it off. However, this was an option that a lot of women fell back on if they were widowed or needed a means to support their family, and they had small kids at home who they couldn't leave to go, work as a domestic servant or in a factory. So the inspiration for fashion in the 19th century came from fashion magazines. Basically, the people who were doing the most in terms of creative things with clothes was Paris and London. And these kind of fashion centers of Paris and London would put out these beautiful illustrated kind of like what you see there, these fashion plates. And American publishers like Mr. Peterson or Mr. Godey would get their hands on these French fashions or English fashions, and they would have them copied over for their own magazines. And, copyright was a little more loosey-goosey back then, so they could get away with it. And so these magazines are going across the country. They're going to rural areas, they're going into cities, they're going into poor people's houses, they're going into rich people's houses. So everyone is kind of able to have access to an idea of what is in style now. What you're looking at is basically like the equivalent of a Vogue editorial spread. This is like the high end of fashion. And so women are not going to be necessarily looking at this and thinking like, I need something exactly like this. They're going to be looking and noticing like what details are kind of new this season, like maybe sleeves are 3/4 length this season instead of full length, or, maybe we're doing vertical ribbons on our skirt. And they would take that inspiration and they would either, if they're making their own clothes or if they're working with a dressmaker, they would often alter an existing dress rather than starting from scratch. They would kind of take something they owned and freshen it up a little bit so it looked like it was in style for the season. Or they might have a new dress made for themselves. And usually, if you were kind of like a middle class person, you might get like a new dress every year, like 1 or 2 new dresses made every year. People's wardrobes definitely were not as big as ours are today. And then, as I mentioned, they would work with a dressmaker. You would use your existing dresses as a pattern, typically. Sized commercial patterns didn't become available until the 1880s. When they did, that kind of helped to really democratize fashion because it made the construction of these garments a lot easier. All these options are available. On the left is a pattern catalog. So you can see there's like 20 versions of sleeves that are available, and then the patterns come sized, so it's a little more simple to like cut out and make yourself. And on the right there is a bodice that I think was probably made by a home sewer with a pattern. It's a kind of precise fit to get. It's like an ambitious thing to do, and she didn't do it quite right. The buttons are spaced weird and not spaced perfectly, so I don't think she executed it the way that a dressmaker would have, but she did a decent enough job to give herself something to wear. And then the sewing machine, it's basically invented in the 1840s and is around in the 1850s. But the early sewing machines were very expensive, and they were pretty big and heavy. And if they broke down, it was kind of hard to get them fixed and replaced. After the Civil War, sewing machine companies like Singer made big pushes to get them into women's homes. So there were layaway kind of promotions and a lot of marketing targeted at women. So you see in the 1860s, they make their way into middle class homes first, and then by the end of the 19th century, they're pretty standard up and down kind of the economic scale. And so this is really a game changer in terms of women's ability to make their clothes. A shirt that would have taken 10 hours to make before now can be finished in an hour and a half. What's funny is that as sewing machines become popular, initially there's kind of this moving of the goalposts that happens in fashion. The 1870s especially is just a really overdone ornamental decade. And that dress on the right there shows you an example. There's the bustle and there's ribbons and there's lace and there's bows. And so all the time that women were saving, sewing on a sewing machine was getting eaten up because, the fashion was so like elaborate in that decade. So now I'd like you to ask, how much time have you invested in the clothes that you're wearing? And I'll go ahead and answer for myself. It probably took me about 7 minutes to gather up the laundry and take it downstairs and throw it in the machine. Another like 3 to move it from washing to drying. Another 2 to haul it upstairs and fold it. And then I did run a quick iron over it this morning because it was a little bit wrinkly, so add another 2, So like I'm trying to say minimal investment in the time that we wore clothes or invested in clothes. Not the case in the 19th century. I'm going to be talking about what it took to care for clothing, starting with mending clothing, then making over clothing, washing clothing, and then finally what happens to clothes at the end of its life, recycling clothing. And this image here is of a sewing basket that's in the museum's collection, and I really like it because first of all, it's intact. So these are actually the tools that this woman was using when she was sewing. And it's also got a little poem that she clipped from the newspaper. And so I feel like this is just the equivalent of, like putting an inspirational thing on your fridge or on your workstation at work. It's a place where you go to and see daily. And she probably wanted her favorite verse there to kind of like inspire her on a day-to-day basis. So mending clothing, this image I love because first of all, it shows how young kids were when they started sewing. That little girl's probably 4 or 5 years old, and she's probably sewing clothes for her dolly there. And then once she gets the hang of that, she'll move on to helping her mom with, basic sewing or mending in the household. I like that it shows the intergenerational nature of sewing. She probably learned from her grandma there or from an older female relative in the house. And it also shows that mending and sewing is a lifelong task for women. As long as your eyesight holds out and you're still able to pick up a needle, you can expect to be sewing and mending throughout the course of a woman's lifetime. Mending is just an absolute constant in women's lives because, again, people in the 19th century didn't have as many clothes as we did today, and they like put them through a lot more than we do. There's a lot more walking, there's riding horses, there's a lot more physical engagement with your environment, and all that takes its toll on the clothes that you wear. So you might patch your clothes, which is covering up the hole with a new piece of fabric. And if we could go back in time, we would probably see a lot of patched clothing. It would be standard. And when we see images of the past, they're paintings or photographs where you're not going to notice little like bits of mending. But I bet if we saw these people in real life, it would become apparent that everyone's basically wearing patched clothes unless they're in a brand new garment. This is a pair of pants that I wish we had at the State Museum. Unfortunately, it lives somewhere in England. This was discovered in a working man's cottage that dates to the 1820s. It was stuffed up a chimney. It probably was put up there to like block a draft at some point. But this is probably what a lot of people looked like in the 19th century. This guy, this might have been his only pair of pants. Maybe he had, a second pair for church, but he's got patches on top of patches, and this is a functional garment that he needs to keep going, to keep clothed. And, today it's like, well, you can buy a pair of pants, at the store for $20. So we have such an abundance of textiles and inexpensive availability that we've sort of like moved past the idea of like, wow, you really need to like conserve something and keep it going like this man did. This man also wore a patch jacket. He wore out his elbows. You can see the little worn spot there and how they've been patched. And this kind of shows how everybody wore mended clothing. This jacket belonged to Thomas Jefferson from the year 1800 when he was president of the United States. So again, wearing clothing was just standard. People wore it out. They needed to be fixed. There was too much invested, too much money and too much labor invested in clothes to put them aside if they became damaged. You just had to fix them and move on. So again, this is typically the view that we see of the past, is looking back at a portrait. And I look at this woman and I think like, this is her Instagram family photo, like this is the way that she wants to portray herself for posterity, that her house is tidy and the kids are well behaved and all the kids' clothing is cleaned. And this is very much as much of a fiction and a filter as Instagram is, because I bet if we saw this woman in real life, her house would be messy, the kids' clothing would be stained, they would be patched. There's probably patches on all their clothing, which they've kind of airbrushed out for posterity, but that was the reality. And so having this kind of like glossy, perfectly mended kind of ideal was as much of a status thing for women as having a curated Instagram profile is for certain people today. Having patch clothing wasn't just a matter of like practicality, so there's not like a breeze at your knees or elbows. It's also a sign of a well-tended and well-maintained home. It sent a signal to the community that you cared about your personal appearance, about presentation, that someone's looking out for things. So there's this kind of larger metaphor of women sort of like mending the social order and the social fabric by keeping on top of clothing and keeping sure that everyone looks presentable. By the other half of the token there, if you see an image of someone in the 19th century with like torn clothes or ragged clothes, that was like meant to be a very distinct visual shorthand for the viewer that like something is awry here, like that this person is not well cared for, is impoverished, is, kind of maybe out of control. So this is a painting of a gang of street youths from 1894 walking through New York. And they're little kids, so they're not like super dangerous, but still they're making people uneasy. You can see that one woman is like holding the child in the background. And all these kids basically have ragged clothes. They're ripped and they're torn. And the implication is like, where's their mom? Like somebody should be watching out for these kids. Somebody at home should be mending their clothes and also giving them some moral instruction and giving them some chores to do and basically keeping them off the streets. And again, right now they're kids. They're not like super threatening, but you also kind of understand that like these kids are going to grow up and what are they going to do with this like unruly energy once they become full-grown people. So everybody mended clothes. Didn't matter if you were super wealthy or super poor. It was pretty standard work. So if anyone's seen Downton Abbey, they kind of portray, the upstairs, the Crowleys, as living a life of ultimate leisure, and the service staff is kind of doing it all for them. And in America, this really wasn't the case. Nobody was that rich where they were totally exempted from housework. There was a prevalence of domestic servants. There was a large labor pool, especially with waves of Irish and German immigrants prior to the Civil War. And after the Civil War, there were Southern and Eastern European immigrants coming in. And so middle-class families typically could hire a live-in domestic servant. However, that person is not relieving the housekeeper of all her work. They're basically working alongside her, and they're splitting up duties. So if you're a housekeeper and you've hired someone to come in and do your work, probably the things you're going to assign to them are the ones that you'd prefer not to do yourself. And so that tends to be, like maybe cooking or washing the dishes or carrying out the chamber pots, or kind of the like heavy and more dirty labor. Women of the house, even if they did employ servants, typically did their own sewing. And this is because sewing at the end of the day is not that like physically taxing. She could sit in her chair, someone could be reading aloud, and she could be doing her sewing and mending while, the cook is like bending over a hot stove. So everybody mended. And this is a great example from our collection. This belonged to a woman named Isabel Flagg, who's pictured up in the right there. This is a very lovely silk bodice that dates to around the year 1900. And Isabel was her father-in-law was the Secretary of State of Illinois. So she married well. She was pretty affluent, but she wore holes in her clothes, even her nice silk Sunday bodices, and she darned them and kept wearing them. And what's neat about the garments we got from Isabel, we got about 6 or so of her bodices, and they are all worn in the exact same spot. So there must have been something about the way that the corset fit her and the way she moved her arms when she walked, that she wore a hole in the same spot in all her garments. And I often wonder what she would think if she knew that we know this very personal detail about her. People also did a lot of darning. Darning is different from mending in that with darning, you are essentially reweaving a patch of clothing, like a hole that's been worn, and this is done pretty much usually for knits. So on the left is a pair of mittens, and these are great because in the beginning, someone tried very hard to find yarn that matched and darn them nicely, and then by the end, you can tell they've totally given up. They're somebody's old mittens. They are just doing a very basic job to make sure that the hole is sewed up, but they don't care anymore about how it looks. And then on the right, those are Isabel's socks, and I love them. It's hard to tell from this photo because they're light colored socks, but they are darned on top of darned. The toes are darned, the heels are darned. They've been darned multiple times. And it's so cool to me because it's like, boy, she loved these socks. Like these were probably her favorite pair of socks. And she put a lot of time and effort into keeping these things useful so she could keep wearing them. Okay, talking about making over clothing. This is a quote from a magazine of 1896. There are very few who do not renovate and make over their old dresses when they have grown too old-fashioned to be presentable. So again, textiles are an investment. When you're done with the dress, when it's not in style anymore, there's no Goodwill basket to throw it into. You're going to try to salvage as much of the fabric as possible and keep that dress going for as long as you can. The first way to do that is to cut down an adult's garment and turn it into kids' clothes. So maybe the dad of the family has worn holes on the knees of his pants. They might be cut down and made into, pants for the kid. Or let's say mom has a work dress and it's pretty faded and it's stained in places. If it's, a big skirt with 8 yards of fabric in there, surely there's a couple decent yards in there that you can cut up and turn into, a garment for a child. You might also take scraps either from existing garments or kind of, from the work basket, the leftover scraps from making clothing, and create something new with it. So what you're looking at here is the underside of a quilted petticoat that dates to the 1850s. So if you were to flip it right side out, it would just be kind of one pattern of fabric. It looks lovely. But on the underside, you see that there's like 4 or 5 different pieces of fabric going on. So she's kind of Frankenstein different scraps of fabric she had laying on to create a garment. But, you know, it's an undergarment no one will ever know. You might make over a dress. So making over generally involves like cutting it apart, taking out the offending parts of it and putting it back together. Or you might like refashion it in a way that's more stylish, you know, like take off bows or add ribbons somewhere to kind of spruce it up. So a common trick was like Thomas Jefferson's coat that he wore out at the elbows. You might cut the sleeves off and flip them around so the worn part is on the inner elbow and doesn't show anymore, and it looks nicer on the outside. And so typically for work dresses, women chose dark colored fabrics with small prints on them. The dark color is going to hide soiling and staining better, and the small prints are more forgiving if you are going to like cut it apart and rework it. And if anyone's a fan of Little Women, you might remember that Meg wished she had a new dress at one point, but she had her blue dress freshly turned and trimmed, and so it was almost like new. And that means she's, you know, cut out all the parts that were stained or worn, and trimmed means she's put new ribbons on it or kind of dressed it up a little bit, and so it almost seems like a new garment. This is a dress that we have in our museum's collection, and it started life in the 1860s. It was your basic, you know, Civil War era hoop skirt dress. And we know that today because the center part of the bodice is still pretty classically 1860s. It's got these dropped shoulders and the kind of darts at the bodice. But someone got a hold of it at one point and tried to turn it into a dress in about the middle of the 1890s. And we know that because those huge poofy sleeves are very characteristic of the 1890s. So they took all that fabric in the dress and slimmed down the bell-shaped skirt into an A-line skirt. Probably some of the skirt fabric went into creating those poofy sleeves. And so all this, you know, very lovely and probably very expensive material didn't go to waste. It was repurposed even over a span of like 30 years later. And so now we're coming to washing clothing. Washing clothing was, again, primarily women's work. And in the 19th century, there was this kind of confluence of there's the Second Great Awakening, there's the rise of the middle class, there's rise in ideas of kind of cleanliness and hygiene, and they all come together to create this ideal of cleanliness is next to godliness, where people are starting to almost conflate cleanliness with morality. So on the left is a poor family and they're in rough circumstances and their clothes are dirty, but are their clothes dirty because they're poor, or are they poor because they're in rough circumstances? It's hard to tell, but obviously everyone wants to be like the family on the right, who's it's very, you know, tight family circle and everyone's happy and clean and well kept. And the message being you can get that if you keep yourself and your family clean. And so what goes into washing clothing? Basically, the things that are being washed at home are your white undergarments, the linens and the cottons, your sheets and towels and pillowcases, the men's shirts, anybody's drawers, women's chemises and petticoats. And this is because these white cotton and linen fabrics can hold up to washing. Dyes especially weren't super color fast, so you know, you could wash your calico cottons. They're going to show it after a while. You're definitely not going to dunk something like a wool dress or a silk dress into a washing tub and scrub it. Those things you're just going to spot clean, and the chemise underneath or the shirt for a man underneath is going to be absorbing all the sweat. And so those under layers are kind of like people's underwear today. You put on a fresh one every day if you can. I love to look through our collection and notice when there are laundry marks on clothes. And laundry marks function exactly like today when you send a kid off to summer camp and you write their name and their underpants with a Sharpie just to make sure the right garment goes back to the right person. And so if you picture a household that's got, a mom and four daughters in it, and everybody is washing their chemises on the same day, got to make sure that all these white garments go back to the right people. So women would either write their name on their garments. Sometimes they'd embroider. Some women actually had a stencil stamp that they would stamp their underwear with. Washing was the worst. People called it the great domestic dread of the household. It was just like heavy and unpleasant physical labor that really nobody liked to do. These are all the steps that Catherine Beecher laid out in 1843. So per load of laundry, it's sorting and soaking and washing over a tub of really hot water and wringing out and scrubbing and rinsing. And sometimes you might use bluing in there to get the whites whiter, and starching and drying, and then literally rinse and repeat for however many loads of laundry your family had. Washing clothing was so unpleasant that it was kind of like a joke. Like everybody understood that washing was the worst task in the household. So much so that there was a comic ballad that was floating around before the Civil War about washing day, and it goes on and on. These were songs that people would like gather around their family piano and they would sing and entertain themselves by doing that. Some of the lyrics include, I'm not going to sing it for you. I don't even know the music, but my Kate, she is a bonny wife. There's none so free from evil, unless upon a washing day, and then she is the devil. I met a friend who asked of me, how long's poor Kate been dead? Lamenting the good creature gone, and sorry I was wed to such a scolding vixen while he had been far away. The truth it was he chanced to come upon a washing day. So this visitor remembers Kate as being this very sweet-tempered woman and sees this, shrew, and figures that Kate must be dead and the man must have remarried. And he's like, no, no, still Kate, it's just washing day and she's in a really bad mood. So, washing clothing is the first task that people hire out if they have any disposable income. Even if you can't afford to have a domestic servant in your household, oftentimes you might hire a laundress to either come wash clothes in your house or to take your clothes and bring them back clean. And so, laundresses tended to be, they were often women of color, they were often immigrant women, they were often widowed women. It was a way for women to make money. And again, it had the advantage for women who had kids that if you're doing washing in your own house, you can be home supervising your kids while you're making money. You also have the advantage of kind of being your own boss. You can accept which clients that you want to take on. And if you're taking laundry to your own house, you're doing your work under your own supervision and on your own kind of clock, rather than living with someone as a domestic servant where you're basically in their space and on their clock all hours of the day. So what will you do with the clothes you're wearing when you no longer want them? If it was in the 19th century into the 20th century, the first thing you might do is make it over. Again, you paid good money for these textiles. You're not just going to throw it away. So you might cut them down and make them into something like a doll or a housewife, which is a little sewing kit that you see there. You might also save your rags, especially if they're linen and cotton, and you could sell them to the rag man. So the paper industry in the 19th century literally depended on rags and people saving their linen and cotton rags. Without those rags, there would have been no paper. And so the paper industry had a vested financial interest in making sure that they got rags from people, which is why you could save rags in a rag bag and you could take them to your general store and trade them in for credit. Or sometimes there would be a peddler, a ragman, who would come around and buy rags from you. You might turn old fabric into a quilt. This is a quilt we have in our museum's collection that's made from old suits. So you might either, cut down worn fabric or take things from the scrap bag from your making projects and turn them into something new and useful. Or you might take woolen clothes and have them turned into a rag rug. The rag man doesn't want your wool, he only wants your linen and cotton, but wool fabrics can be cut up in strips and then sewn end to end, and those strips of fabric rolled into a ball like you see there. And then this can either be braided, woven, or you can send away your rag balls and have them come back as a rug. And then let's talk real quick about fast fashion because we have come full circle from generally being producers of clothing to consumers of clothing. In the late 20th century and up to where we are now, the cycles of fashion have sped up really quickly. It used to be when I was a kid that there was kind of like a spring line and a fall line, and I did back to school shopping and then maybe got some summer clothes. Now there are literally 52 micro seasons. So there are new fashions being churned out weekly and new designs are hitting stores weekly. So the business model is there's always something new. Those clothes are very inexpensive. You're meant to buy frequently. The clothes don't really last, so they wear out frequently, and then you just kind of keep buying. So fast fashion is fast, literally, like someone designs it and then 6 weeks later it hits a store and is ready to buy. It's inexpensive to buy. It's inexpensive to make, and it's usually produced overseas in countries with limited labor laws. So if you are producing clothes in a country like the United States, which has laws about worker safety or overtime or minimum wage, that's going to raise your bottom line. But there are plenty of countries in the world that are not that concerned about those things. And so a lot of garment production actually takes place over there. Fast fashion is also hard on the environment. It's not great for rivers around places where they dye clothes. The polyester is putting a lot of microplastics into the environment, and a lot of textiles are discarded. We are in this kind of rapid consumer buy and then throw away. I only spent $10 on this. What am I going to do with it? I'll just pitch it kind of cycle that a lot of clothes are literally disposable these days. Again, it's hard on the workers who are underpaid. The thing is, it's hard to stop. It's a system, and even people who have the skills to make their own clothes, which not everybody does anymore. I certainly don't. My mother knew how to sew, but she didn't teach me. Even if I did, if I were to go and buy fabric and buy notions and take the time to make my outfits, it would cost way more than it would if I just went out and bought something. For better or worse, like it or not, most of us are now consumers of clothing. But to reduce that impact on, workers and the environment, things we can do are to buy less, to try to break that cycle of like constant shopping. I know I shop my feelings, so, I can do less of that. Choose things that are made of quality things, rather than buy like five cheap t-shirts, buy one well-constructed, shirt, and then make it last. Buy things that are classic, maybe dress them up rather than get something new and trendy. And then I just want to finish with some thoughts about clothing and the way it impacts our lives today. How has shopping for clothing changed in your lifetime? How is the shopping experience different for you than it is for your parents? How has caring for clothing changed in your lifetime? And how has your attitude about clothing changed in your lifetime? So I will leave it there if anyone wants to chime in on any of these questions. If you have questions about anything I said or just kind of want to share a memory, I would love to hear it.
Oh, thank you, Erica. That was wonderful. It was great presentation and very interesting.
Thank
We
you.
we do have a question in the Q&A. I don't know if you're able to pull it up or I can read it.
Let me see. Oh, I did not see scissors in the sewing basket. They would have been expensive. Nope, that's an excellent point. Yes, people would have had probably multiple pairs of scissors. There would have been like a nice big pair of tailor shears for cutting the fabric, and then like a smaller pair for cutting the thread and everything. And you would also want to keep it sharp too. So some people had like the little like sharpening things in their sewing basket. And do I know what the recycled plastic is that appears on most clothing today? I don't know specifically. I've seen, like my son carries a backpack to school that is made from recycled, like plastic bottles, like plastic water bottles, which is kind of cool. But yeah, I know there's lots of strides being made, and kind of with the rise of internet shopping, in my lifetime, and we've gone from like clothing stores to like the mall to now we're at internet shopping, but there are people who are kind of making an effort to be sustainable and to incorporate recycled materials, which is cool. When did pinking shears come into play? That is a great question. And I am not a sewer myself, so I'm relating secondhand because I asked someone that bodice that had the hole under her arm that belonged to Belle Flag, that had pinking shears along the bottom. And I think you use them when you don't want fabric to fray somehow, but again, I'm not a sewer myself, so I don't fully understand, but if someone does do sewing and wants to chime in on that, then I would welcome. And then someone in the comments said they buy clothes at thrift stores. Older garments are often better quality. Absolutely, they totally are. And that's also very eco-friendly too. You're buying it at thrift stores, you're keeping them out of landfills. So that's fantastic.